So, there's this unspoken rule in certain segments of the Black community in which you're never supposed to publicly criticize a Black person who is making something or doing something in a field in which they are a minority, which, as you can imagine, is most of them. And something I hate about this mindset, that I would argue tends to be more of an older generation, is that in an attempt to form a united front against so many of the challenges that we face in this country, in so many of the rooms in which we're the only one, in which we're the token, I think sometimes constructive critique, sharing problematic themes, or just general taste issues, I like this or I don't like this, get put by the wayside. And of course, not every Black person subscribes to this. I mean, in the public debate, we have intellectuals like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Cornel West going at each other about ideas and the state of race and politics in America. But the reason I have this meandering opening is because I was not sure if I wanted to talk about The Souls of Yellow Folk by Wesley Yang. And that is because I did not like this book for a variety of reasons. And yet I was a bit concerned. Do I want my first video of May, which is Asian American Heritage Month as well as Jewish American Heritage Month, to be critiquing a book that claims to be writing about the souls of Asian America? I had so many reservations before I realized that this was just internalized hypocrisy. The same way that I have no problem with the idea of fully critiquing, and when I say fully, I mean with your chest, media made by someone of your own community, I feel the same way about not pulling punches about media made by someone beyond your community. And I think some of this hesitancy is coming from a place of, I would like to say, awareness, because we know how subjective arts are, we know how subjective critiques are, and yet for generations and still today, there are a handful of people who hold coveted positions as paid critiquers, paid tastemakers, who tell the general populace what to read and what to watch and what to listen to, that in these positions that are so consolidated most of the time, 9 times out of 10, among cis older white men, that some people are like, okay, let's be a bit more mindful before we just jump in, guns blazing when it comes to critique. But I don't feel the situation is that. I am going to break down some of the themes in these essays, some of my critique of the marketing, some what I believe is the use of ableist rhetoric, and my general critique about some of his arguments around white supremacy, what is whiteness, and what he calls identity politics in relation to successive ideology. And in this case, while of course we are going to be talking about race, since it is a book that is supposedly meant to focus on that, I don't think that precludes me from having an opinion on the literature. So, with that long meandering intro, this is The Souls of Yellow Folk by Wesley Yang. Wesley Yang is an essayist who's worked with The New Yorker, Harper's Bazaar, New York Times, just general nonfiction essays. And I have to say, and y'all remember this from my last rant review, 9.9 times out of 10, I love the books I read because I spend time researching them. And as you can imagine, I did not research this. I was in a bookstore looking at a completely other section of books, and when I saw this title, The Souls of Yellow Folk, which of course is a reference to W.E.B. DuBois' seminal, iconic work, The Souls of Black Folks, and I got excited. In addition, they clearly have essays written on here, and I've read a number of essay collections, and I have more on my, to be read list. So I like a collection of nonfiction essays. And here's what my first issue is with this. The Souls of Yellow Folk. This title conveys, and along with the book that it's referencing, a collection of essays about the Asian experience, or the Asian American experience, a collection of essays about race and xenophobia and cultural values, and perhaps Yang's own personal experiences as an Asian American man in this country. And yet, only a handful of the essays actually reference that. If you look at the table of contents, you'll see these broken this up into 3 chunks. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. And 1, 2, 3, 4 of the 10 essays explicitly have zero reference whatsoever to race entirely. About 7 of the essays, I'm thinking about game theory, on reading the sex diaries, are essays that he wrote for other publications, which is fine, at different points in his life, which is also fine, but again, have nothing to do with the title. Now, while I found it very interesting to read about Aaron Swartz, the technological genius who was indicted for downloading millions of files from JSTOR, while it was interesting to learn about some of the origins of pickup artists and the game theory and the way that some of the founders have evolved over time, that is not what I picked up this book for, because all of these men were white. These were cis white men, and some of these topics that Yang was paid to write about for these publications have nothing to do with the souls of Asian folks. Now, I don't mean to imply that if you are from a particular identity or marginalized community, you're only allowed to write about that. Absolutely not. And even in these essays that I had zero interest in about people I had never heard of, the care was there, the insight was there, the introspection, that he is very clearly a talented writer. But I felt like it was not even subverting my expectations, it was just not respecting them, because when you have a title like this, you expect some theme throughout all of the essays, even though they are written between 2008 and 2018 when this was published. And the only theme I could find across these essays was this continuous tone of resentment, this continuous tone of feeling entitled to a life in which your word is important, in which you're going to change the world while rejecting the system, which for his case often meant not holding a salary job for several years. There was this theme of losers and outcasts. And while I do understand, especially in some of the earlier essays, how he was connecting that to perhaps what he defines as the Asian American male experience, the experience of being invisible, of being a nobody, of assimilating so much that you lose all sense of texture and color. He talks about, the rage young men feel at being outcast. And while all of these things are valuable, of course, it's not on me to speak about the Asian American, or specifically in his case, Korean American experience. It seemed, again, like an odd thematic choice for a book of this title. And what was also interesting about reading these essays that were written over the course of a decade is I could see some of the themes that he wrestled with the most coming up over and over, even in essays that seemed to have nothing to do with it. I could see certain phrases that he liked to repeat over and over. And again, it made me wonder if I would have enjoyed this book more if they had been more clear with the title, or more clear with the back jacket. It's just like, hey, these essays, and they're great, about what I was actually getting into, because this title was not indicative of the contents, and I kind of resent using that marketing ploy of being like, hey, this is the Asian equivalent of The Soul to Black Folks, when it absolutely is not. If you have not read The Soul to Black Folks by W.E.B. DuBois, please pick it up. It is an amazing text, and he is the one who originated the phrase double consciousness, which is something that blew my mind when I first read it. The other thing I disliked about this book is, especially in his earlier essays about the Virginia Tech shooter, which I did not know because I wasn't born when it happened, was an Asian American man, the way in which he, yes, acknowledged some of the actions that individual took that led to his own isolation, that pushed him away from other people, he also seemed to be making certain concessions that I simply don't agree with. Now, in the introduction to this book, he makes specific reference to that first essay, and he says it was written all in one night, via Gmail, and he had various editors come in. He mentioned it was written at a time in which these school shootings were not happening. Like, Virginia Tech was one of the most, unfortunately, iconic, that's not the right word, unfortunately, it was one of the landmark experiences that shaped American politics that me, someone who was born 4 years after, is just used to, unfortunately, and I fucking hate that we're used to it. But at the time, shit like that wasn't happening, and so I want to give him some leeway with that. But to have a section in this book about this Virginia Tech murderer in which you bring up the fact that Nikki Giovanni, who was teaching a class in which the murderer was enrolled, could perhaps have made different decisions when she went to the dean and asked him to be removed from her class, could perhaps have looked at his poetry differently, which she called violent and intimidating. And he brings up a poem of Giovanni's from 1968 that talks about violence and race and says, oh, what if this killer had connected his rage, connected his disconnect to his Asian identity? Would she have read his poetry differently then? And I found that so frustrating, because in the text he also writes, and I looked it up too to make sure I wasn't getting just one opinion, Giovanni went to the dean to have this killer removed from her class, not only because of the poetry, but because he was making other students uncomfortable, because he was taking photos of women and their legs underneath table without permission, without consent, and it had become so rampant that the majority of the class had stopped showing up solely because of him. He was not only intimidating Giovanni with his work, he was also intimidating and harassing other students in class, and that is unacceptable. I also resented the fact that in this book he mentioned a sex worker that the killer engaged with about a month before he murdered 32 people. He paid the sex worker for an hour in which she was dancing for him, and according to her account, he tried to climb on top of her, tried to touch her, and she pushed him away and was like, yeah, no, I'm done, I'm leaving. Which is completely within the rights of any human being to revoke access to their body, no matter if you're a sex worker or anyone else. And in this book, he makes this connection about reaching out and wanting to be touched and like these deep feelings of loneliness, and what would it have meant if that sex worker hadn't rejected him and instead leaned into him. Again, I'm seeing another incident in this essay in which a woman, whether it's Nikki Giovanni, whether it's the unnamed sex worker, seems expected to, seems not partially responsible, but there's some implication there that there's something that could have gone differently that would change this young boy's life. And I found that incredibly frustrating, especially because this book is just dripping in masculinity. And by masculinity, I don't mean toxic masculinity necessarily. I personally don't believe that all masculinity is toxic, but his view is so rooted in that of being a man that the only women in this book that are mentioned are the Nikki Giovannis, are the sex worker, are the girls that called campus security on that Virginia Tech killer because he kept messaging them and showing up at one girl's dorm, and they were scared of him, didn't press charges, didn't want him arrested, just want him to push away. There again seems to be this anger that he has, this very Holden Caulfield energy throughout this whole book, when he talks about, he doesn't use the word phonies, but he talks about losers and outcasts and how people don't know what it feels like to be so disconnected from society. You can clearly tell he has wrestled with some of these things himself, and I definitely appreciate his candor in admitting some of the naivete of his younger years and some of the ridiculous idealism that simply by rejecting the workforce that means that you somehow are like fighting the system and things of that nature. But that essay really frustrated me. Another essay that frustrated me involved this conversation he was having around a man he met at school, Rutgers. And in opposed to writing in first person in I thought this man was fat and ugly. I thought this man was pretentious. I suspected this man was a liar, and I turned out to be right. All of these negative things. For that whole section, he uses you. You would feel the sexual desperation on him. You would see the sebaceous glands in his rolls and sense his despair. You realize that he deep down was incredibly lonely but didn't know how to reach out. You. This damning critique of a person that I'm sure I would never want to interact with, but this damning critique that he doesn't take responsibility for his perception of until the end of the few pages, where he puts in parentheses, of course I may be projecting, but this is my memory. That is one of the only times he uses I in that section. In another section, he talks about a little bit about classism, and he says, let me ask you this: would you ever date a South American or a Latin American laborer, someone who slaughtered your meat or cut your fruit? Of course you wouldn't, because this. Again, using you. And while I'm not trying to get on my high horse, I most likely never would date a Latin American or South American laborer, specifically because of the unconsciousness in which I've created a system around me, a culture around me, in which everybody speaks English as a first language and everybody has a college degree, and many of these laborers tend to not have the access to education. I'm not trying to white knight this conversation being like, yes, I would date them. My problem is he makes these grand statements and directs them at the reader as if the reader is inherently complicit and inherently in agreement with Wesley Yang's opinions, and I simply do not agree about that. Now, one thing I will say, those particular aspects I disliked, and one other aspect that I'll get to, happened in the essays that were written in like 2008, 2009, 2010. I understand that people change throughout the years, and you can tell a difference in some of his writing style at the beginning of the book and some at the end. But to include all of these essays as written with, I'm not saying change it and pretend it never happened, but with like no added context, with no footnotes. I mean, I loved that Octavia Butler added a few pages of context and retrospection after each of her short stories, fictional stories, in the book Bloodchild. Also in Ta-Nehisi Coates, another collection of essays. We were 8 years in power. Before each essay, again, he contextualizes what was happening. He critiques some of the things he says and stands by other things he says. When you're doing a compilation of essays that were all written on separate topics at separate periods of time, and you put them together in a volume like this with no commentary and no context, to me that is implying that you stand by everything you said, which I would hope over 10 years there are ways that we would grow and develop. In addition, I think I mentioned ableism. If I haven't, here we go. Something that frustrated me is, again, in these earlier essays, there is no mention of disability at all, except as a metaphor for the negative. So, for example, he talks about a group of people who are taciturn to the point of autism, as if all autistic people are nonverbal, or if being autistic or nonverbal is an inherently negative thing to be. He talks about a confrontation he has with that person he calls fat and ugly and awful and pretentious and a liar, and talks about how they both have this pretentiousness. They both have this internal loneliness. And he described it in visuals as a scene in which two paraplegics are fighting each other in a wheelchair and then fall out of their chairs and can't get back up again, a scene from a movie. And again, this frustrated me because the only mentions of ability or disability, except in a later essay in which he is interviewing someone with ALS, who an illness/disability, depending on how you look at it, are used as metaphors for the negative, for the ridiculousness, to heighten the situation. And that's simply not a rhetorical technique that I think is valuable. I don't think it's considerate. And frankly, it's inaccurate in terms of the way that you are showing disability, and by you, excuse me, look at me, I'm doing that now. By the way Yang, it shows disability in these texts, again, except for that one interview with a political commentator and historian and teacher whose name I'm forgetting, to be negatives just rub me the wrong way. And you could say, okay, those particular essays were written in like 2008, 2010. People talk differently about language then. Cool, great. I understand and respect that. Absolutely no context given. Even in books like, which I'm still reading, Pleasure Activism, when Adrienne Maree Brown is citing all of these people, these interviews, these researchers, she provides her own footnotes. For example, she'll provide a footnote on something that Audre Lorde or Bell Hooks said that she doesn't agree with, or give context saying, hey, at this time, people were reclaiming the word dyke in a way in other places they weren't. And I think that is so valuable because, again, when you're gonna collect a volume of information, whether it's information that you have written and sourced or information from other people, or whether it's all your original words, I feel like you're responsible for the words you put on the page. Another thing that frustrated me about this text is that when we got to part 3, which admittedly were the shortest essays, which I found interesting, essays specifically referencing We Out Here, It's Okay to Be White, and What is White Supremacy, the last 3, you could clearly see that this was a person who had major critiques of identity politics, which I think there are critiques to be had, especially considering about how the term has evolved so far away from the originators of the Combahee River Collective, what they imagined. But it frustrated me again in these arguments about white supremacy not just being the KKK and police brutality, but also being the series of microaggressions, stereotypes, daily interactions that uphold this structure. While he was critiquing those things, of course he was using the most dramatic examples. Like, he was using examples of real things that happen that pretty much every leftist, every activist, every whatever progressive, whatever we're calling this side of the spectrum, completely agreed were ridiculous or agreed were misappropriation of terms, and using that as like, see, this is why we should only use the term white supremacy to talk about things like genocide and war, and not talk about the daily interactions and invisible systems that uphold this inequality, because that's watering down what the real word means, which is an argument. I'm not saying that argument isn't out there, but just it frustrated me that of course he was using those very individual situations as opposed to acknowledging the myriad of ways that having a broader definition of white supremacy can benefit, educate, and also challenge some of our upheld beliefs. Another thing that I fundamentally disagreed with, which again does not make this a bad book, the other issues that I had with it were more pressing, was the way in which he argued that the expansion of language when submitted to social media platforms becomes politicized. And while I completely agree that people on Twitter, people online in general, can take these big, interesting topics, these words that have been rumbling around humanities departments, gender studies departments, academic departments, race departments for years, and try to synthesize it down to the simplest understanding to be tweeted out, and then in that tweet making it political move, I'm in complete agreement with him on that part, completely. But again, it felt very, very strange to have at the beginning of this book more essays that are specifically about him and about other Asian American people who I would argue are struggling and suffering under the same system that perhaps Black people, Latinx people, Middle Eastern people, Polynesian people, etc. are struggling under, and then get to the end of the book and spend these last few essays mainly critiquing some of the techniques, some of the rhetoric, some of the exploration of language, expansion of definitions that I believe have been really critical in moving us forward in this conversation. Now, again, this title, this backlap, none of this marketing, none of this information promised me like a solution to race. That's not what I was looking for. What I was looking for, hopefully, were some of his opinions to the affirmative. You know, I feel like it's very easy to sit in a particular position and challenge and critique and poke holes in the way people are speaking and the things they are doing and the choices they are making in pursuit of activism, in pursuit of equity, in pursuit of liberation. But I kept waiting for his ideas. I kept waiting for like, okay, so how do you navigate this as an Asian American man? Like, how do you navigate this as someone who specifically has Korean immigrant parents? The whole North Korea, South Korea divide and war, you know, just colonized, or excuse me, you know, powers coming in, trying to colonize and take resources. You know, you have America on one side and China, the Soviet Union on the other. Like there is so much, I think there is so much that could be said about having parents who survived, excuse me, specifically his mother, surviving horrible things, and then coming to the United States and comparing your experience to your parents' experience and being like, oh, well, being the least attractive on a dating site according to this OkCupid poll is not as big a deal when compared to what my mother went through. Valid. Like, I was super interested when he honed in on that topic, and then immediately we swung away into another topic entirely. I'm like, oh, but what was that? What was that there? That comparison? That, oh, the things that my prior generation experienced are not the things that I'm experiencing. But does that mean that what I'm experiencing doesn't matter, that it's okay? How does that particular sentiment that was in, you know, one essay tie into what you're saying at the end of the book, or excuse me, what he's saying at the end of the book about white supremacy? You know, were those racist slurs you heard, were those expectations, those wrong and insidious and daily ways that people were treating you, those microaggressions, which he doesn't land particularly on a stance about the phrase microaggression, but at least the tone of that essay seems pretty deriding. The microaggressions that he has mentioned he's experienced early in this book, how does that tie into what he's saying at the end? So overall, this was not a book I enjoyed. While there were individual moments where I felt that I was getting, information about a topic I was actually interested in. No shade to all of the people that he biographied. A number of them are dead at this point, but when it came to this book, I felt like there were glimpses of things that really hit upon the implied promise of this title. I felt that there were glimpses of moments where he seemed able to talk about his personal experience combined with a larger Korean American in specific, or Asian American in in a more broad sense experience. I felt like there were moments where there may have been an intentional or unintentional through line about loneliness, about disconnect, about invisibility, about the role of men and mental health. Like, that was like the men and the mental health, I felt, was the shadow over this entire book. Like, there were so many sections where it was like hinted at but never spoken, never claimed. I'm not even sure if he says anything about mental health, with the exception of defining the Virginia Tech killer as mentally ill and then crazy and then batshit insane. But that was all over. The fingerprints of, the male suicide rate, of men not being able to process their emotions, of the way the patriarchy affects men negatively so they can't fully experience some of the most beautiful things that I think about being human, being vulnerable and intimate, combined with the added racial layer of Asian men being perceived as less attractive, or Asian men being perceived as less virile or masculine. And he talks about, the concept of invisibility. There was like so much of that in here that he never quite landed on, which I also found disappointing, because I think could have made for a fascinating thematic through line, or even a final essay in which, he looks back over all the other essays that he chose for this collection over 10 years and keeps picking up on that specific theme. Like, just to give you an example, if you have read the book, the very first essay, The Face of Song Ho Cho, definitely that one. Eddie Huang Against the World, The Life and Afterlife of Aaron Swartz not being an Asian man, but still. The Liveliest Mind in New York, there's definitely themes of loneliness and mental health there, especially the whole chapter on pickup artists, game theory, the misogyny of some of these pickup artists and how it moved into self-help. Like, so many of these essays would tie into that theme, and yet either he didn't see it or he simply was not interested in writing about it. So this is The Souls of Yellowfolk. While I am going to participate in Cindy's, from Read with Cindy's Asian Readathon, and one of the prompts is read a book by an Asian American author, I'm not going to choose this one, because why choose a book for a prompt / event that's meant to celebrate books that you love that also happen to be written by Asian Americans by highlighting a book that I really truly did not like. There are other books that I have read already this month by Asian American authors that I love, or Asian Canadian authors. Actually, I have a lot of Asian Canadian authors on my shelf, I think just as much as Asian American. So I'm super excited to talk about those with you later this month. But this was not for me. And frankly, after finishing it, thinking about it for a while, and filming this video, I'm even more frustrated that they chose this title, because W.E.B. DuBois, Wesley Yang ain't. So, the souls of yellow folk. And if you've made it this far into the video, which I'm sure is probably incredibly long, I would like to say, if you are so inclined, please, in my next video, click the link in my bio for a particular partner, a particular brand I got to work with. Don't have to buy anything, you don't have to send it to anybody, but just by clicking it, it helps me, and in the future I may be able to have more brand partnerships, brand deals that hopefully will involve money, because your mama's got, what? Student loans. So thank you again, happy Asian American Heritage Month and happy Jewish American Heritage Month, and I will see you next time. Bye.